I am indeed, Janet. I'm here for a few weeks to speak at a conference in Birmingham, and also today I was speaking at the Hudson Institute on Islamic fatwas about religious freedom, and then doing a conference in Toronto. So a short trip to speak in a few different places before going home again.
I'm so glad that you are. And I'm so glad also, Mark, that you can tell us up close and personal exactly what's going on in Australia first before we talk about this global movement. You know, I listened to one of your presentations and you talked about the story of the two Dannies, the Catch the Fire story. Would you share that with our audience?
Yes, it was after 9/11 when Daniel Scott was invited by Daniel and Elia, the two Dannies, to present a seminar on Islam and understanding jihad and how to reach out in love to Muslims. And at that time, there were three converts to Islam from normal white Australian backgrounds. They'd become Muslims, and they came during the day and they made a complaint using our brand new then religious vilification laws. The case went through the courts and tribunals, and it took 5 or 6 years to sort out. But at first, pastors were found guilty of vilifying Muslims, and then they appealed. It went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. In the meantime, they'd been banned about speaking about Islam anywhere in Australia, and they won their appeal. The appeal said the judge had made many errors, one of them being not distinguishing between being critical of a religion and attacking those that believe in it. But it was very intimidating and quite a difficult time for them, and they had to raise many hundreds of thousands of dollars to pursue their defense. So it's a good example of what people call Sharia by the back door, that is using laws meant to protect multicultural society, but actually as a platform for imposing Sharia restrictions on freedom of speech.
Boy, do I hope, Mark, that people resonate with what you just said. We're just now sensing this for the first time here in the United States. I think it's much more entrenched in the UK. You have identified it so clearly, and yet I'm not sure here, because America likes to consider herself to be a very tolerant nation. And so we have these conversations, and we're loath to say, well, wait a minute, if you were to put in a second tier of law, Sharia law, like they're doing in the UK, you're not going to foster the very freedoms on which this country was founded. You're going to do exactly the opposite. Am I right?
That's exactly right. What's happening in the UK is they're creating two systems of law, and people will be disadvantaged. For example, Muslim women in the UK will be disadvantaged by having to deal with their family issues in a Sharia court, where the cards are stacked against them. So they're really creating a system where Muslim women, in that case, are second-class citizens, and a separate society where instead of this wonderful principle of the British common law that everyone's equal before the law is being replaced by a system where people are not equal, some are more equal than others. Muslim men have more value in the Sharia courts than Muslim women, and unfortunately the leaders are asleep at the wheel, and even the Archbishop of Canterbury said this is not an alien system, we should welcome this. And so there's really a folly that seems to have gripped people's minds, and they are allowing a beachhead for a very oppressive system of law to find its way into the society of the United Kingdom.
Would you explain in Australia first what you see happening, and then globally if you sense a pattern?
Well, the pattern is that people take a framework that was developed to discourage racism and then apply it to religion. So they try and control people's speech about religious beliefs, as if you criticize another religion, you're a racist and you should be silenced. And Islamic activists see this as a great opportunity for stopping people criticizing Muhammad or Islam. And there are a lot of things that need to be criticized in Islam and should be as part of normal public discussion and debate. And so you have this situation where people are promoting Islam, but at the same time preventing people from being able to criticize it. And if you're found guilty, as cases have happened in Canada and other places, then you're accused of being a hater, a vilifier, all because you've perhaps been speaking the truth. It was very disturbing in Melbourne because the lawyers on behalf of the Muslims said it doesn't matter if these pastors were speaking the truth, it's still vilification, and they should be found guilty. So the truth is not a defense in these crimes. It's not like defamation where you can defend yourself by proving that you've spoken the truth. It really relates to Islamic law prevents people from insulting Muhammad or criticizing Islam or hurting other people's religious feelings. So these values of Sharia law are becoming part of our culture. We're accepting them. And newspapers today are accepting the idea that you can't speak of Islamic terrorism because that's disrespectful to Muslims. So this is beginning to shape our whole culture, and people are becoming intimidated and silenced as a result. The effect of that is that it'll quieten down and prevent people from having the public debate that has to happen about the value or lack of value in Sharia and its implications for people around the world today.
You know, Mark, something very interesting, particularly, and I appeal to you now as a pastor, if you're simply going to do, and this is one of your areas of expertise, is this idea of comparative religions, systematic theology, comparative religions. If you're going to do a side-by-side, here's what Jesus said, here's what Muhammad said, if that gets dropped into the context of if you dare to say anything, you've hit the tripwire of a hate crime, what is it going to do for us and our mission to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ? It seems to me there's a profound chilling effect there.
There is. And look, Jesus is absolutely amazing. He responded with such grace and moral authority to the many challenges and insults that were thrown against him. Muhammad, on the other hand, responded to rejection with violence, cruelty, and bitterness. And you really need to explain those differences to people. Muslims need to know the Lord Jesus, and they need to know who Jesus is. And the comparison is very significant. Also, Islamic law is based on the life and example of Muhammad. So if someone's selling Islam to us or promoting Sharia law, they're actually promoting the example of Muhammad. And we need to be able to ask, well, what does that mean? You know, why did he do the terrible things that he did? This should be part of public discussion. And also people will lose confidence in their own faith if they're not able to bring these things into the light. When I first began to study Islam intensely, I must admit I was deeply distressed in my spirit by what I discovered about Muhammad, but it did have the effect for me of making me feel so much happier to be a Christian because Jesus is just so beautiful and a wonderful man to follow and the right person to follow. And I'm very determined to be telling that to people. Who will you follow? You know, you're going to follow Muhammad or you're going to follow Jesus? And let's talk about what difference it will make. And we need to claim the freedom to do that.
Mark, what led you to do this intensive study of Islam?
Before I became a pastor, I was an academic, and my specialty was linguistics, and I'd studied the language of the people of Aceh in Indonesia. The Acehnese are a very intensely Islamic group. They have the one part of Indonesia now where Sharia law has some application, and I am, I suppose, still the world's expert in the language of Aceh, and had taught in numbers of universities in America and Australia. I gave that up to be a pastor, and I thought I'd never really have to think about Islam and jihad again. Jihad was a big part of Aceh's history. But when I saw 9/11 happening, it was early in the morning in Australia. I was woken up by a call, and someone said, "You really have to see this, Mark." And as I watched it, I knew exactly why it had happened and who could have done it. And since then, I've been devoting a day a week or so, working intensely on Islam. My desire is to wake up the church and wake up the society around us. This is a matter of great urgency. Islam will be the greatest ideological challenge to Christianity and to the West in the century ahead. And there's a lot of catching up to do in terms of educating people and equipping them for the challenge that lies before us.
So when you dug into this in your readings, in your studying as an academic, people will often say, well, the teachings of the Quran are misinterpreted. They're not hostile. They don't preach about jihad. Jihad is a personal struggle. It doesn't have anything to do with the war. I ask people who are experts in this, and by the way, was thrilled to see that my friend Robert Spencer has given you an endorsement, and Ravi Zacharias, and people who are marvelous in their own right. How do you answer the question? And I know you must when you're out speaking and on the debate circuit as well, when people say, but it's a peaceful religion misinterpreted by some. Is that right or wrong? It's completely false. Islam was always spread by the sword. Muhammad commanded his followers to give non-believers, non-Muslims, three choices: to surrender or die by the sword or become a Muslim. And jihad means to fight against non-believers to establish Islam. If you picked up a theological textbook, an Islamic theological textbook, and there's a chapter in it on jihad, it's not going to be about self-improvement. It'll be about battle and taking slaves and how to kill people. If you look up a collection of Muhammad's sayings, the so-called hadiths, there'll be a whole book of jihad, a kitab al-jihad, and that will be all about warfare. There won't be a single paragraph in it about being a better person or
And see, the problem is it's such a bad message, really, that Muslims living in the West have really had to sugarcoat their understanding. And in fact, sometimes they find it themselves very hard to accept. So they actually end up believing that jihad is just about personal struggle. But it's certainly not, and it never has been. It's a technical term in Islamic theology. It does mean struggle in its basic meaning, but as a technical term of the religion, it's fighting non-believers.
So, Mark, if there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, why do we not see more incidences of terrorist activity compared to what we've seen, which is bad enough, but why do we not see more just given the demographic?
Well, that's a good question. There actually have been thousands since 9/11, so there's a huge number happening all the time. I think it goes against the grain to ask people to fight. Many people just want to get on with their lives and raise their children, and so many Muslims have ordinary human desires and goals for their lives. And you mustn't assume that just because the religion does actually teach this, that everyone is all signed up, sealed, and delivered to follow those instructions. But there are a lot that are.
Let me take a break. Susan, you're in Columbus, Ohio. Thanks for being with us. Your question, please, for Dr. Durie. Hi, Susan.
Hi. This is kind of a broad question. I've heard of Sharia law, but I don't know. What are the specifics of it? Is it you can just have one religion and you can't have Christianity, or?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, Susan. Mark.
Sharia means a path, and it's basically a set of rules for life that's based on Muhammad's teaching and example. And part of its idea is that the people that follow Muhammad, who are Muslims, should follow these rules, and other religions should be inferior. They're dominated by Islam. So Sharia is the law of the land, and other religions have to kind of bow down and fit in with that law. So Sharia law is quite cruel in some ways. If strictly speaking, if you steal something, your hand would be cut off. If you're an adulterer, you should be stoned to death. It discriminates against women. It sets the marriage age for girls according to Muhammad's example at 9, because he married a girl who was 9. So a very, very different system of law from our understanding of law in the West.
And Mark, particularly for us as believers, most problematic is there is no place for religious freedom. And certainly the headlines on a regular basis are filled with stories that give evidence to that end, correct?
That's exactly right. If you're a Christian living in an Islamic society, it's against the law for you to criticize Islam. In traditional Islamic law, you were not allowed to display a cross anywhere. You were not allowed to technically to build a church or repair a church. You would be sort of stuck in limbo really forever in the situation you were when you were conquered. So many discriminations. Your testimony in Sharia courts, a Christian's testimony is not valid against a Muslim testimony. So, for example, in Pakistan, if your Muslim neighbor accuses you of doing something, your word is not valid in your own defense. So many disabilities, so many disadvantages that Christians have in an Islamic situation.
And things could get even worse. Mark, would you be so kind as to address for a moment the OIC at the United Nations, who they are and their constant drumbeat to try to get a resolution passed that speaks that no one is allowed to, quote, disparage any other religion. And, of course, the only religion they're interested in protecting is Islam. Why is that problematic, not just for Christians, but for Muslims and their religious liberty?
Yes, the OIC is like the United Nations of Muslim countries. There's 56 countries, and they together are a bloc. And they've developed a plan to try and get the United Nations to pass an international law that no one in the world is allowed to criticize Muhammad or criticize Islam. So if you wrote a book, for example, describing what Muhammad did and said, and it was thought to be critical, you could find yourself breaking the law. I'm speaking about the United Kingdom or about Australia or America. So they want that to happen, and that will really be terrible. And it's particularly bad for Muslims because they should have the right to reject Islam. An ordinary Muslim should have the right to say, look, I don't like Muhammad. I don't think that what he did was right.
Yes.
But if you said that as a Muslim in Saudi Arabia, I don't like Muhammad, he was wrong, technically that's apostasy. You're regarded as having left Islam. You could even be executed as a death penalty applies for insulting Islam. And So this is an attempt to make the whole world submit to the rules of Islamic law, all based on the example of Muhammad and what he showed people as the way to live.
A second-class citizen. Can you explain this?
Yes, when Islam was conquering nations, people were invited to become Muslims. If they refused and weren't killed or enslaved, the only other choice for them was to surrender and live as a second-class citizen. They were understood to be governed by a pact called a Dhimma pact, and they were called in Islamic law Dhimmies. And there's a whole set of laws in Islam for the non-Muslims living in an Islamic country, for example, the Christians in Egypt and the Christians in Iraq. And basically they have to buy back their life each year in the traditional rules of Islam, where they pay a tax each year. It's literally a head tax in the sense that you're buying your head back.